Hello, friends. How are you doing? Happy Monday. How has your week been? Well, let me tell you about mine. Mine has been busy. Just doing homework, and more homework. And I'm actually recording this late Sunday night. So, I don't know when I will be done editing. And that's the longest part. Other than that, I'm doing good. Chief editor's doing good. I also took some time to sit down and have coffee with friends. I've been going to the gym more often. I know I mentioned that last week. And in a week, I lost 2 pounds. So that is very exciting. I am taking my health into serious account and really working on being a healthier and better me. So I did a poll, and I did it on the Facebook group. I did it on my own Facebook page. I did it on Twitter. And almost every single topic that I had people vote on was pretty even. And this episode barely came in first. And so you guys have helped me out with what the next few episodes are going to be about. So don't worry, whatever your vote is, you will hear it either today or in the next couple of weeks. So, probably by the title, you already know which one won. So, I'm going to start by a little question here. What do you think of when you think of rolls? And I don't mean like soft dinner rolls at Texas Roadhouse, which are butterly delicious. I mean socially, relationshiply, what your role is. So maybe when we think of roles, we think of a husband and a wife, maybe an employer and employee, maybe a parent and a child, or even a podcaster and a listener. Maybe that's what you think of when you think of roles. I am your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you're listening to What the Psychology. Alright, so we talked about the roles that we typically see in our day-to-day life and that maybe we as ourselves identify with. So now let's talk about more of the darker side of this, because that's what we're going to go over today in our experiment. Now, things that we've seen in the past and the present is police brutality and police using unjustified excess of force. Now, I want to make this very clear. There is a big difference between justified and unjustified use of force. I will see people complain about police, and they will complain about something that is justified. And to me, it's really annoying, because put yourself in the policeman's shoes. You don't know what's going through their mind. You don't know how are they perceiving this, or if the person that they used force on was greatly threatening them. Of course they deserve to use of force against that person. There are other cases where police completely out of the water are unjustified in their use of force, and I completely understand that too. But there is a difference. That's why when we do see different cases, it's okay to be mad about it, but get all the facts first. Get all the evidence first. Not all police are bad, and there are a few bad apples that ruin it for everybody. They make all police look bad. We also must keep that in mind. But there are bad apples in every career field, every walk of life. So sometimes the role of a policeman, they take that role to their head, right? They use their position and their authority to be cruel or brutal towards ordinary citizens. So there's that police citizen role, okay? And then in other instances, like we've seen in the media, is like the teacher-student, where a teacher will lure a student into a sexualized relationship, and it's kind of in a rouse to maybe get better grades or for the student to get some kind of gain out of it. And then it's been a long time since there's been anything in the press, but we know that in the past that particularly Catholic priests have been abusive towards altar boys or other members of their congregation. And like I said, there are bad apples everywhere. But the whole point of this experiment, it comes into play about roles. And I was watching a film about this, and I thought it was really cool because they brought up Milgram's experiment, which, of course, we went over a few weeks ago. And just like that experiment, this one is also has a lot of notoriety in intro to psychology textbooks. That's how I learned about this case as well. And I had some people recommend it. And I'm like, yes, I love that experiment. We're going to talk about it eventually. And so here we are. We are at eventually. Dr. Zimbardo, he is a psychologist. Him and his colleagues, they were interested in finding out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards. So, for example, if they were dispositional, or if it had more to do with the prison environment. So, maybe, example, situational. So that is another issue that we've seen. I know I talked about policemen in general, but there have been many conflicts between prisoners and guards, and they were trying to figure out if it was a personality or an environmental issue. Prisoners and guards, they may have personalities which make conflict inevitable. Prisoners, they lack respect for law and order, and then guards being demurring and aggressive. So alternately, prisoners and guards, they may behave in a hostile manner due to the rigid power structure of the social environment in prisons. So Zimbardo, he actually predicted that this situation would make people act the way they do rather than their disposition. So he was pretty much saying that the environment, the situation makes for these conflicts rather than personality. What did Zimbardo do? He wanted to study people's roles and the way that they play in prison situations, although this can be applied to many other situations. And we will talk about other situations a little bit later on as well. So Zimbardo, he converted a basement of the Stanford University Psychology building into a mock prison. And just like Milgram, he advertised asking for volunteers to participate in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. Unlike Milgram, he was actually upfront with what his study was going to be about. He did have applicants that applied. There were 75 of them, and they were given diagnostic interviews, personality tests. That way they could eliminate candidates with already present psychological problems, anyone with medical disabilities, or if they had a history of crime or abuse. They wanted people that were going to be the most stable for this experiment. Now, one thing I will say is this advertisement was put out to students, so most of the participants were 18 years old, or around 18 to maybe 22, I'll say. And one thing that we will probably cover in another episode is your brain is not fully developed at 18. Even though at 18 you're technically an adult, your brain doesn't fully develop until you're actually in your 20s. And one of the last things to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the judgment sphere of the brain. That is why in most criminal courts, that's why they have that whole standard of charging them as a juvenile or charging them as an adult. And they take a lot of things into account, their age and the act, mental state, those kind of things. So I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but that is important to know that their brains aren't even fully developed yet. And that's, for me, going to be a personal criticism of this experiment later on. Out of the 75 applicants who did answer this ad, 24 of them were judged to be the most physically and mentally stable, most mature, the least involved in antisocial behaviors. They were chosen to participate. And antisocial behaviors, that's a whole nother episode. But the basics of antisocial is that they lack empathy. They didn't want to have anyone in this experiment that was straight up had that personality where they just straight up didn't care about other people's well-being. So the participants, they did not know each other prior to the study, and they were paid $15 per day to take part in the experiment. It was going to be about a 2-week experiment, and it was mid-August. So probably a lot of the students were about to start their fall semester. So it was kind of like a summer job. So out of the 24 participants, they were randomly assigned whether their role was going to be a prisoner or a guard. And they were going to be in a simulated prison environment. Now, there were 2 reserves and 1 dropped out, and that finally left 10 prisoners and 11 guards, which we will kind of get into later, okay? So picture this, and it's funny because now we're sitting at September 5th. So this was on August 14th, 1971. Maybe some of you were alive then. I wasn't even thought of yet. So those chosen to participate, they got randomly assigned their roles. Those that were assigned the role of prisoner, they were taken off guard, okay? They were treated like every other criminal. They were arrested at their own homes without warning, and they were taken to the local police station. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and booked, kind of like any prisoner would. Then they were blindfolded and they were driven to the psychology department of Stanford University, where Dr. Zimbardo had the basement set up as a mock prison. He had barred doors and windows, bare walls, small cells. And this is where the de-individuation process began. So, when the prisoners arrived at the prison, they were stripped naked, deloused, had all their personal possessions removed and locked away. They were given prison clothes and bedding. They were then issued a uniform and referred by their number only. So the use of ID numbers was a way to make prisoners feel anonymous. Each prisoner had to be called only by his ID number and could only refer to himself and the other prisoners by number. Their clothes comprised a smock with their number written on it, but no underclothes. They also had a tight nylon cap to cover their hair and a locked chain around one ankle. Now the whole thing about them being identified by ID numbers and stripping away their identity, that really makes me think of, 1, the Holocaust, and 2, the military in a sense. But in the military, at least when you go to basic training, you're still called your name, your last name. And yeah, but this just kind of gives me Holocaust-y vibes, because they were given numbers and were only identified as their numbers as well. So all guards were dressed in identical uniforms of khakis. They carried a whistle around their neck and a billy club borrowed from the police. Guards also wore special sunglasses to make eye contact with prisoners impossible. So they were trying to strip away, like, kind of the humanity aspects of both parties. Now, 3 guards, they worked shifts of 8 hours each, and the other guards, they remained on call. Guards were instructed to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison and to command respect of the prisoners. However, no physical violence was permitted. And thank God, because who knows where this would have turned if it was permitted. Because even the way that the prison guards treated the prisoners was still pretty awful. Dr. Zimbardo, he did observe the behavior of the prisoners and the guards as a researcher, but he also acted as a prison warden, which we will see later was not the best idea. So with a very short time, both guards and prisoners were settling into their new roles, with the guards adopting theirs quickly and easily. Even Dr. Zimbardo was to say after the first day, nothing's really going on, so this is going to be a very long and drawn-out experiment. He didn't think that anything was really going to come out of it after that first day. However, within hours of beginning the experiment, some of the guards began to start to harass the prisoners. At 2:30 a.m., prisoners were awakened from sleep by blasting whistles for the first of many quote-unquote counts. So So the counts served as a way to familiarize the prisoners with their numbers, and more importantly, they provided a regular occasion for the guards to exercise control over the prisoners. So the prisoners, they actually adopted prison-like behavior too. They talked about prison issues a great deal of the time, and they told tales on each other to the guards. So they kind of began to snitch on each other too. They actually started to take the prison rules very seriously, as though they were there for the prisoners' benefit, and that infringement would spell disaster for all of them. So some even began siding with the guards against prisoners who did not obey the rules. Although guards were not allowed to use physical violence, they were allowed to use physical punishment. The prisoners, they were taunted with insults and petty orders. They were given pointless and boring tasks to accomplish, and they were generally dehumanized. I think even at one point the guards made the prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands, which is really gross. They made them do push-ups. That was the common form of physical punishment. One of the guards actually stepped on the prisoners' backs while they did push-ups, or they made other prisoners sit on the backs of fellow prisoners doing their push-up.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up in a line and have me hurl insults at them and make them do exercises. When you interrupt people's sleep, they tend to become a little disoriented. And since there was no daylight in the prison, they had no idea whether it was night or day. I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
Now, because the first day passed without incident, the guards were surprised and totally unprepared for the rebellion which broke out in the morning of the second day. So already the prisoners are like, okay, we've had enough. During the second day of the experiment, the prisoners, they removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the door. Now, the guards were like, no sir, we're supposed to maintain law and order here. So guess what they did? They called in reinforcements. Now, there were 3 guards who were waiting on standby duty, and they came in, and the night shift guards voluntarily remained on duty. So the night shift guards are really taking this seriously. Now, because of this quote-unquote rebellion, the guards, they retaliated by using a fire extinguisher, which shot a steam of skin-chilling carbon dioxide, and they forced the prisoners away from the doors. Next, the guards broke into each cell. They stripped the prisoners naked and took the beds out. The ringleaders of the prisoner rebellion, they were placed into solitary confinement. They had like this little closet that they turned into what they called the hole. After they would put the ringleaders of this rebellion into like the solitary confinement, they began to harass not only them that were in the hole, but also the other prisoners. And even at one point, they had the other prisoners bang on the door of the storage, where the hole was yelled, and they would pretty much yell at the person in there that this is all your fault, and you're the reason we're being punished, and they were trying to make that person feel even more isolated by kind of turning against them.
While 416 was still in the hole, John Wayne made a final attempt to break him by giving his fellow prisoners a choice. They could vote to release him by making a small sacrifice.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now what will it be? What will it be over here? How about 5486?
I'll give you my blanket, Mr. Burkle. You don't want his blanket. We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3, guess one. Keep your blankets. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
There were a few special privileges going on here. So there were 3 cells, and one of the 3 cells was designed as a privilege cell. The 3 prisoners least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. The guards gave them back their uniforms and beds, and they allowed them to wash their hair and brush their teeth. So they were giving them some special treatment for saying, you didn't participate in this rebellion, so we were going to reward you. Privileged prisoners, they also got to eat special food in the presence of the other prisoners who had temporarily lost the privilege of eating, and the effect was to break the solidarity among prisoners, and it seemed to work. Now just think about this, even those that participated in the rebellion, they took away their food privileges. Like, who does that? Even when you're put into like solitary confinement in real prison, not that I know that I've been, but from what I've seen and from laws and whatnot, they still get fed. They still get their 3 square meals a day, even though they're not the best. So over the next few days, the relationships between the guards and the prisoners changed, with a change in one leading to a change in another. So it's kind of like a ripple effect here. Remember that the guards were firmly in control, and the prisoners were totally dependent on them. As the prisoners became more dependent on the guards, the more the guards became more derisive towards them. They held the prisoners in contempt, and they let the prisoners know it. And as the guards' contempt for them grew, the prisoners became more submissive. As the prisoners became more submissive, the guards became more aggressive and assertive. They demanded even greater obedience from the prisoners, even though they were already being pretty obedient. And because the prisoners were so dependent on the guards, they tried to find ways to please the guards, such as snitching on other prisoners. So we're going to talk about one of the prisoners here. So, prisoner number 8612, less than 36 hours into the experiment, prisoner number 8612 began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. After a meeting with the guards where they told him he was weak but offered him informant status, he returned to the other prisoners and said, "You can't leave, you can't quit." And another thing is, not only did he go have a meeting with the guards, he also had a meeting with Dr. Zimbardo. Now remember, Dr. Zimbardo was the psychologist in charge of this experiment, but he was also the quote-unquote superintendent of the prison. And he didn't realize this, but he was starting to take the role of being a superintendent seriously. And so when 8612 came to talk to Dr. Zimbardo about getting out, Dr. Zimbardo's like, I'll talk to the prisoner guards so they treat you more better, but you're going to have to maybe tell on other prisoners, and if that doesn't work, then, you can leave. And he left. He was, very confused, and so he went back and told all the other guards, you can't leave, you can't quit. We're pretty much here for forever. Now, after this, number 8612, he began to act crazy. He began to scream and curse, go into a range that seemed out of control. And it wasn't up until this point that the psychologists realized that they had to let him out. So that he was very distressed and that they cannot keep him under these conditions. So the next day, the guards, they held a visiting hour for parents and for friends. And they were really worried about when the parents saw the state of the jail that they may insist on taking their sons home. So the guards, they washed the prisoners. They had them clean and polish their cells, fed them a very big dinner, and they played music on the intercom. After the visit, there were rumors spreading about a mass escape plan. And afraid that they would lose the prisoners, the guards and experimenters, they tried to enlist the help and facilities of the Palo Alto Police Department. Yeah, they actually reached out to the local police department to try to get help. Remember, guys, this is an experiment. An experiment. It's not a real prison. The guards, again, they escalated their level of harassment because of this quote-unquote escape plan. They continued to force the prisoners to do menial repetitive work. Like I said, cleaning the toilets with their bare hands, doing push-ups, standing against the wall, all these kind of things. Now, Dr. Zimbardo, he did invite a Catholic priest who had been a prison chaplain to evaluate how realistic their prison situation was. So half of the prisoners actually introduced themselves by their number rather than their name. And the chaplain interviewed each prisoner individually. Now, the priest kind of played a role in this too, because he told the prisoners that the only way they would get out was with the help of a lawyer. So he was making them feel even more desperate in the situation, like they were in a real prison. Now we're going to talk about another prisoner. Eventually, while talking to the priest, number 819 broke down and began to cry hysterically, just like 2 other prisoners did. But those 2 prisoners were released. So at this time, it was kind of seen as a concern. Dr. Zimbardo pulled him into his office. He removed the chain from his foot, from the cap off his head, and he told him to go and rest, and that he would give him some food and take him to see a doctor. He also told him that, you're not a bad prisoner. This is an experiment. This is not a real prison. Okay? Now, while this was going on, one of the guards lined up the other prisoners, and they were all shouting loudly, "Prisoner number 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner number 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer." So Dr. Zimbardo realized that he could hear the chanting, and he went back into the room where they found him sobbing uncontrollably. Dr. Zimbardo tried to get him to agree to leave the experiment, but he was so caught up in this, and he said he could not leave because the others had labeled him a bad prisoner. Now at this point, this is when Dr. Zimbardo really realized the extent of this experiment and how it was actually affecting others. And I think he even realized that he kind of took it too far by playing into the I'm a superintendent role rather than a psychologist. Dr. Zimbardo went to number 819. He said, "Listen, you're not number 819. You are blah, blah, blah." He told him his name. "And my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I'm a psychologist, not a prison superintendent. This is not a real prison. This is just an experiment. Those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go." So he stopped crying suddenly, looked up and replied, "All right, let's go." He acted like nothing had been wrong. So Zimbardo, he intended that this experiment would be 2 weeks. But by the 6th day, it was terminated. This was due to the emotional breakdowns of prisoners, the excessive aggression of the guards, and what really brought this to a close was a recent Stanford PhD student, Christina Maslach. She was brought in to conduct interviews with the guards in the prisons, and when she saw everything that was going on, she strongly objected to everything because she saw the abuse that was going on. And she had to pose a few questions to Zimbardo, like, what's the point of this experiment? Like, you're responsible for letting these things happen to them. Zimbardo, he did note that it was not until, that moment that he realized how far into his prison role that he was at that point. Like, he was really thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist.
The guards had lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet, had bags over their head, chains on their feet, and were marching by. And I looked up and I saw this circus, this parade. And I said, "Hey, Chris, look at that."
I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just, I just turned away and I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, we had a big argument. You're supposed to be a psychologist. This is this interesting dynamic behavior in such a few days. But I'm going through this whole thing, the power of the situation. She says, no, it's that young boys are suffering and you are responsible. You're letting it happen. I said, oh my God, of course you're right.
So in conclusion, according to Zimbardo and his colleagues, the Stanford Prison Experiment revealed how people will readily conform to the social roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of the prison guards. Because the guards were placed in a position of authority, they began to act in ways that they would not usually behave in their normal lives. The quote-unquote prison environment was an important factor in creating the guards' brutal behavior, and none of the participants had acted as guards. They didn't show any sadistic tendencies before the study, and like I said earlier, they were all vetted before they were picked to participate in this experiment. So therefore, the findings, they support the situational explanation of behavior rather than the dispositional one. Remember, situational was the prison environment and dispositional was the personality theory. Zimbardo proposed that two processes can explain the prisoner's final submission. The first one is de-individuation. So that explains the behavior of the participants, especially the guards. This is a state when you become so immersed in the norms of the group that you lose your sense of identity and personal responsibility. So the guards, they may have been so sadistic because they did not feel what happened was down to them personally. It was a group norm. They also may have lost their sense of personal identity because of the uniform that they wore. These are things that sound very similar to the Milgram's experiment. If you remember, we said that the uniform played an important role whether the person would press the button to administer shock or not. Whether the Mr. Gray lab coat was nearby in his uniform portraying as a scientist or authority, then they would administer the shock. But if he was far away, then they were less likely. And then this is also talking about like group behavior. They were playing along the norms of the group. So they were losing their sense of identity and personal responsibility. That sounds like bystander effect a little bit, doesn't it? Because remember, there was the diffusion of responsibility. Well, as an individual, they didn't feel responsible because they were part of a group. The whole group would take responsibility. So I just find it interesting that the previous Milgram's experiment and the bystander effect that we went over in previous episodes, how deeply rooted those are, kind of the same things found in this experiment as well, at least slightly. Also, there was learned helplessness, and that could explain the prisoner's submission to the guards. The prisoners learned that whatever they did had little effect on what happened to them. In the mock prison, the unpredictable decisions of the guards led the prisoners to give up responding. And after the prison experiment was terminated, Dr. Zimbardo, he did interview the participants. And I'm going to read a quote here. Most of the participants said they had felt involved and committed. The research had felt real to them. One guard said, "I was surprised at myself. I made them call each other names and clean the toilets out with their bare hands. I practically considered the prisoners cattle, and I kept thinking I had to watch out for them in case they tried something." Another guard said, "Acting authoritatively can be fun. Power can be a great pleasure." And another, "During the inspection, I went to cell 2 to mess up a bed, which a prisoner had just made, and he grabbed me screaming that he had just made it, and that he was not going to let me mess it up. He grabbed me by my throat, and although he was laughing, I was pretty scared. I lashed out with my stick and hit him on the chin, although not very hard, and when I freed myself, I became angry." So most of the guards found it difficult to believe that they had behaved in the brutalizing ways that they had. Many said they hadn't known this side of them existed or that they were capable of such things. The prisoners too couldn't believe that they had responded in the submissive, cowering, dependent way that they had. And several claimed to actually be more assertive types normally. When asked about the guards, they described them in the usual 3 stereotypes that can be found in any prison. Some guards were good, some were tough but fair, and some were cruel. So there is some critical evaluation to this experiment, and there are ethical issues as well. And of course, I said it earlier, one of my criticisms is that the prisoners and the guards, they were all around the age before their brain was fully developed. So that could be a criticism of either the results of the study. There were other variations that I can think of that were criticisms of the Milgram experiment that also ring true for this one. They were young college boys. Women weren't not a part of the study. They did kind of take out personalities, but was it the type of personality that would volunteer for something, that would act in these ways? Those could be criticisms. Now, other critical evaluations include they demand characteristics could explain the findings of the study. Most of the guards later claimed that they were just acting. Because the guards and the prisoners were playing a role, their behavior may not be influenced by the same factors which affect behavior in real life. So this could mean that the study's findings can't be reasonably generalized to real life, such as real prison settings. So this could mean that the study has low ecological validity. Now, however, this is considerable evidence that the participants did react to the situation as though it was real. There's a lot of evidence to not support the criticism. So, for example, 90% of the prisoners' private conversations, they were monitored by researchers. They talked about the prison conditions, and only 10% of the time were actually conversations about life outside the prison. Guards, too, they rarely exchanged personal information during their relaxation breaks. They either talked about problem prisoners or other prison topics, or they did not talk at all. The guards were always on time and even worked overtime for no extra pay. When the prisoners were introduced to a priest, they referred to themselves by their prison number rather than their first name. The study may also lack population validity in the same as what I was saying earlier with one gender and them being male students. And another thing is that would this be applied to other countries or other regions of the United States? No, a strength of the study is that it has altered the way U.S. prisons are run, which is a good thing. So, for example, juveniles accused of federal crimes are no longer housed before trial with adult prisoners, and this is due to the risk of violence against them. Another strength of the study is that the harmful treatment of the participants led to the formal recognition of ethical guidelines by the American Psychological Association. So now studies, they must now undergo an extensive review by an institutional review board, which in the US, or an ethics committee in the UK, before they are implemented. So back in this time, it was just like, hey, I want to do an experiment. I'm going to let these prison guards do whatever they want, except for physical violence to these prisoners. All right, cool. Go ahead, do your thing. Like, there was no process to make sure that everything being ran was ethical. And in the same, the Milgram's experiment. This is the one that broke the horse's back for them to finally be like, okay, we can't allow these type of unethical experiments anymore. We must have a plan and guidelines into place. So a review of research plans by a panel is now required by most institutions, such as universities, hospitals, and government agencies. These boards, they review whether the potential benefits for the research are justifiable in the light of the possible risk of physical or physiological harm, or even psychological harm. Now, these boards, they may request researchers to make changes to the study's design or procedure, or in extreme cases, they could deny approval altogether. Now, there were plenty of ethical issues. This isn't really something that we have to talk about because we know the things that happened were unethical, but we're still going to talk about it. Now, there have been a lot of criticisms, including lack of fully informed consent by the participants, because Dr. Zimbardo himself, he did not know what would happen in the experiment, because it was very unpredictable. Also, the prisoners, they did not consent to being arrested at home. They also were not told, partly because final approval from the police wasn't given until minutes before the participants decided to participate. And another reason was because researchers wanted the arrest to come as a surprise, kind of like how they would in real life. This was a breach of the ethics of Zimbardo's own contract that all of the participants had signed. Participants playing the role of prisoners, they were not protected from psychological harm. They experienced incidents of humiliation and distress. A lot of them succumbed to wanting to be released, having uncontrollable bursts of screaming, crying, and anger. Even one prisoner went on a hunger strike. However, in Zimbardo's defense, the emotional distress experienced by the prisoners could not have been predicted from the onset. Approval for the study was given by the Office of Naval Research, the Psychology Department, and the University Committee of Human Experimentation. They did not anticipate the prisoners' extreme reactions that were to follow. Alternative methodologies were looked at, which would cause less distress to the participants, but at the same time, given the desired information, but nothing suitable could be found. Pretty much, even though everyone approved of this study, and I say approved very lightly, no one knew what was going to happen. It was very unpredictable. And that can be very dangerous. And imagine if Zimbardo didn't give the rule saying you can't use physical violence. Like, who knows how far the guards would have taken that. So extensive group and individual debriefing sessions, they were held. All the participants returned post-experimental questionnaires several weeks, then several months later, and then at yearly intervals. Luckily, they were checked on pretty consistently after the fact, and Dr. Zimbardo eventually concluded that there were no long-lasting negative effects, which that is good. He also strongly argues that the benefits gained about our understanding of human behavior and how we improve society should balance the distress caused by the study. However, I don't think that the prisoners that were in the study would agree to that. I mean, if anyone was to come to that environment, would they really think that that was worth it? And it has also been suggested that the U.S. Navy, they weren't really interested in making prisons more humane. In fact, they were more interested in using the study to train people in the armed service to cope with the stress of captivity, which is pretty interesting. Some of this process kind of reminds me of basic training, but basic training, of course, the instructors nowadays, I will say, they are strongly vetted. They have to meet certain criteria to even be a drill sergeant. At least I know all of this in the Air Force. I want to talk about an incident that happened right before I went into the military. And this was talked about a lot when I enlisted. Especially in basic training, they talked about it a lot. And a lot of people know this by the Air Force basic training scandal. This is a military sex scandal which took place at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. For those that are not Air Force or maybe not military that are familiar, everyone in the Air Force goes to the same basic training site, which is in San Antonio, Texas. Unlike the Army has multiple locations that they can go to for their basic training. Now, this scandal, it involved 43 female trainees allegedly victimized by their drill instructors during and after basic military training beginning in 2009. 17 male instructors were accused of offenses ranging from the solicitation of improper relationships to rape, and 35 instructors were removed from their post pending an investigation. They were removed from their jobs right away. They're like, okay, nope, you can't be a drill instructor. You're accused of these things. Yeah, no bueno. So 9 of the accused instructors, they belong to the 331st Training Squadron, and the squadron commander was actually removed from command in June 2012 because of the problems in his unit. In August 2012, the commander of the 737th Training Group was relieved of his position due to the scandal. So what exactly happened? Okay, so investigation of the scandal, it began in June of 2011 when a trainee reported suspected sexual misconduct. In November 2011, 3 instructors reported possible misconduct after overhearing fellow military training instructors discussing something completely unacceptable. Well, and those are in quote. In June 2012, Staff Sergeant Peter Vega Maldonado made a plea deal. He admitted to having an improper relationship and the violation of a no-contact order. Vega Maldonado was sentenced to 90 days in jail, 30 days of hard labor, and his rank and pay were reduced. He agreed to testify against other accused MTIs, military training instructors, in exchange for immunity from prosecution for other related crimes, and it was later learned that Vega Maldonado had sex with 9 other trainees. Now, this next part kind of hits close to home because this was my training squadron when I was in basic training, but of course this person wasn't there when I was there. I went to basic training in 2014, so shortly after all of this was happening. The second case, this actually yielded the longest sentence, which was 20 years, and proceeded to a court-martial. Now, this was for Staff Sergeant Lewis Walker. He was indicted on 28 counts, and that included rape, aggravated sexual conduct, and an aggravated sexual assault. 10 former trainees, they testified against Walker in his week-long trial, and he was accused of having sexual intercourse with 4 recruits. He was convicted on all counts, all 28 of them. And honey, he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. He also had to register as a sex offender. And this is sad. In 2014, this was 2 years after his conviction, he was found dead in his cell and he apparently committed suicide. That's the sad part, because no matter what people do, I don't want anyone to, kill themselves. And he was married and had 2 children. Another case was Tech Sergeant Christopher Smith. He was charged with an improper relationship with one trainee, seeking an improper personal and intimate relationship with another trainee, and obstruction of justice. These charges, they stemmed from an incident in spring of 2011 when Smith drove 2 trainees off the base to meet fellow instructor Master Sergeant Jamie Crawford. So Smith was convicted and sentenced to 30 days confinement and a reduction in rank to Airman First Class. This guy went all the way down from tech to staff to senior airman to Airman First Class. And that means you lose a lot of money, you lose a lot of responsibility, and a lot of trust. Master Sergeant Jamie Crawford, which was the one that Sergeant Smith dropped the trainee off at, he was accused of an improper sexual relationship, providing alcohol to a trainee, and adultery. So I guess he was married. Okay, then we have Staff Sergeant Quentin Estacio, and they were charged with sexual misconduct with a basic trainee student, abusing his authority and obstructing justice. Although he faced a maximum sentence of 43 years, he was only sentenced to 1 year. Alright, then we have Staff Sergeant Craig Leblanc. He was charged with sexual misconduct, obstructing justice, and making a false official statement. He was accused of using his post as military instructor to sexually assault and pursue a sexual relationship with a female trainee. And he also had a wrongful sexual relationship with another. LeBlanc, he faced up to 22 years in prison, but he was only sentenced to 2.5 years. This makes me think, could this be similarly of what the Stanford experiment is? But now I pose that a question because what if when all this scandal happened, the trainees, who knows how they were treated? If there was obvious sexual abuse, there was probably further abuse going on, and who's to say that and who's not? I mean, I guess you'd have to really talk people that were there. But maybe the MTIs that were in that situation, they succumbed to their role and did all these heinous things. And some of the trainees went along with it because they were going to get better treatment. Or maybe they genuinely were interested. But in the cases of rape, obviously they weren't. And sexual assault. There was a lot of resulting from that. But I pose the question of how did this happen? Did those instructors, they really, like the guards in the experiment, they really took that authority role and used it for evil. I mean, that's the basis to it. And then the trainees, kind of like the prisoners, succumbed to their authority because they were dependent on them. The whole reason for this experiment, in Dr. Zimbardo's lens, was there was a lot of reports about prison guards and prisoners and their relationship and the brutality, the cruelty that was happening, and he wanted to know, is this product of environment or personality? And they found that it's more about the environment. Some other questions to pose at you guys. What are the effects of living in an environment with no clocks, no view of the outside world, and minimal sensory stimulation? Maybe consider the psychological consequences of stripping, delousing, and shaving the head of prisoners or members of the military, which they do that as well. And what transformations take place when people go through an experience like this. Now, I can kind of talk on this a little bit because, of course, I was military. Of course, females, they don't shave their heads. But the first or the second night, I can't remember because it's kind of a blur now, but they have you all... Of course, if you have a drill instructor that's the opposite sex, they are not there the first night. They make sure that the same sex drill instructor is there, even if they're not going to be your instructor. And this is why, because they have you all stripped in the shower. You don't even have 5 minutes to shower and then get out. They have you run to where your bed is supposed to be. They have you quickly put on clothes, and they're yelling at you and calling out things that you're doing wrong. And it's all to assimilate you to the environment. It is part of the stripping down and the de-individualization process. And they do that in prisons too. Like, they strip them down, they give them a uniform, they shave their heads. Now, I don't think that all of those things are bad, necessarily, because in the purpose of the military, they're trying to train you all to think a certain way. They're trying to challenge you mentally to where you will respond with discipline, where you will respond with military bearing is what they call it, and that you will follow orders, and that you will all kind of be in the same mind frame. Because when you go to war, those things are going to be very important. If you do go to combat, you're going to hear a lot of noises around you. And it's to keep you focused, keep you disciplined, keep your bearing, and keep you aware of what is actually going on and what's actually important to cue in on. That's just my little take. Another question to pose is, the prisoners could have left at any time, and yet they didn't. Why is that? Another question, after the study, how do you think the prisoners and the guards felt? Did the guards feel like, holy crap, I was really cruel? Did they feel like, oh, I was just playing a role? How do you think the prisoners feel? Do they feel like they were really in prison? Do they feel like now they have a lot of anger against the way the guards treated them? What? How do you think they feel? If you were the experimenter in charge, so if you were Dr. Zimbardo, how would you have done the study? Would you have done it differently? Would you have terminated it earlier? Would you have conducted a follow-up study? Another question, this isn't on my little notes, because I just remembered it. I remember when I first heard of this case, and I was reading some of Dr. Zimbardo's notes on the case. He said that what he wished he would have done was he wished that he would have either not played the superintendent role, or if he did, he would have had another psychologist there to kind of keep things in line, because even he succumbed to the role that he was playing as a superintendent, and he was thinking more in that lens versus the lens of a psychologist like he should. I know in Milgram's experiment, that was more focused on the Holocaust and after the trials. And I know in both Milgram's experiment and bystander effect, there are components of those studies that go into this one as well. So do you think that maybe roles were something that happened in the Holocaust as well? Do you think that was a reason for some of the cruelty? Do you think that's why a lot of the Jewish people just succumbed to the authority? What do you guys think? Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Happy Labor Day! I forgot to say that in the beginning. Make sure you take care of yourself. Do some self-care. Get into the group on Facebook if you're not already part of it. Give me some suggestions because I'm trying to get that group a little bit more involved. I know I did the poll thing and I got some good responses from that. So I'm just trying to make it more interactive. So anything you guys can think of, you can always follow the podcast. We have the Facebook page, which is at WT Psychology. There's also a Facebook group called What the Psychology. If you like the page, you will automatically be invited. But I also have the ability to invite people. It took me a while to figure that out, so I've never ran a Facebook page, so that's my excuse. Also on Twitter at WT Psychology, on Instagram at What the Psychology. Follow, like, share. You can also leave reviews on, I think any platform allows you to do it, but I know Apple has a really good setup for leaving reviews if you want to. I do appreciate any feedback, and I just want to say I am super duper uber whatever looper nooper fooper. I'm gonna keep going to Zooper. Appreciative of you guys, and I would not do this without you. I love psychology. I love learning about these things. I love talking about them and sharing them. But, I am taking 5 classes this semester, and I am trying to work on my physical health and my mental health and doing my hobbies and volunteering. So I do stay busy, and without you guys being so supportive and giving me your kind words and everything. It just keeps me going, and it keeps me wanting to seek out good material for you guys and to cover things that you are interested in too. Even things that I may not be too familiar with, I will look into them and then I will dive into them at some point. So thank you guys. I appreciate you. I am your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you've been listening to What the Psychology. Stay psyched, y'all.